Welcome to the channel. The final slaves. The wine cellar beneath Rosewood Plantation lay cool and silent in the August heat of 1847, a stone sanctuary where Thomas had learned to move like a shadow. At 14 years old, his bare feet made no sound against the flagstones as he lifted another bottle from the rack, checking the wax seal with fingers that had grown wise to such things. Above him, through the thick beams and floorboards, he could hear the muffled voices of Mistress Eleanor Whitmore's afternoon guests, their laughter cascading down like coins into water. The bottle in his hands bore no label, only a small mark scratched into the glass, a mark he had made himself 3 months prior. He held it up to the narrow shaft of light that fell through the ground-level window, watching dust motes dance in the amber liquid. His heart beat steady and slow. There was no hurry now. Everything had already been set in motion. From the top of the cellar stairs came the sharp click of heeled boots on wood. "Thomas?" Mistress Whitmore's voice carried that particular note it took when guests were present, sweeter than usual, performative in its kindness. "Bring up the Madeira, child. De 38 vintage. MRS, Ashford has expressed an interest." Thomas set down the unmarked bottle and reached for the one she had requested, his face betraying nothing. "Yes, mistress." His voice had not yet broken fully, still carrying that high, clear quality that made the ladies above smile and call him that sweet boy. They did not know, could not know, that sweetness itself had become his weapon. He climbed the stairs into the brutal heat of the afternoon, the bottle cradled carefully in both hands. The dining room blazed with light from the tall windows, and 5 white women sat around the mahogany table like lilies arranged in a vase, Mistress Eleanor at the head, her sister-in-law Caroline Whitmore to her right, MRS. Ashford and Mrs. Pemberton from neighboring plantations, and Miss Sarah Kendrick, newly arrived from Charleston and not yet married. They turned to watch him as he entered, this dark-skinned child in his clean but worn linen shirt and breeches, and he felt their eyes on him the way he felt the sun, something unavoidable, something that could burn. "There's my good boy," Mistress Eleanor said, extending one pale hand toward the bottle. But then she paused, studying him with those gray eyes that missed very little. "You look flushed, Thomas. Are you well?" "Yes, mistress. Used the heat of the day. Pour for our guests, then. Carefully, now." He moved around the table with practiced grace, filling each crystal glass to precisely the same level. The women's conversation resumed, flowing around him as if he were merely another piece of furniture. "The vintage has improved remarkably," MRS, Ashford observed, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. "I recall when your husband first laid these bottles down, Eleanor. You've a gift for knowing which wines will mature well." Mistress Eleanor smiled, a small, satisfied expression. "Thomas has proven invaluable in the management of the cellar. He has quite the palate for one so young." The words were spoken with pride, the same pride she might have expressed over a well-trained hound. Thomas kept his eyes lowered, his face carefully blank, but something dark and hot moved in his chest, not anger exactly, for anger was a luxury he could not afford, but something older and more patient. "Does he truly?" Miss Kendrick leaned forward, her curiosity undisguised. "How extraordinary. However did you discover such a talent?" "Necessity and observation, my dear." Mistress Eleanor took a delicate sip from her glass. "When my husband passed last winter, God rest him, I found myself quite overwhelmed with the management of his collection." Thomas showed an aptitude. "I began teaching him the basics, how to identify spoilage, how to maintain proper temperature, how to decant and serve." What she did not say, what none of them would ever acknowledge, was that she had taught him because she had no sons, because her husband's brothers circled the plantation like crows waiting for carrion, because a widow's hold on property was a precarious thing, and because an enslaved child who could manage a wine cellar worth thousands of dollars had value. Thomas finished pouring and stepped back against the wall, assuming the position of waiting that had been drilled into him since he could walk, hands clasped before him, eyes down, present but invisible. "The sweetness is pronounced," MRS, Pemberton remarked. "Almost honeyed. Is that characteristic of the vintage?" "The 38 was an exceptional year," Mistress Eleanor replied. "The grapes were particularly ripe." Thomas said nothing. He knew exactly why this particular bottle tasted sweet. The conversation drifted to other topics, the heat, the cotton crop, the difficulty of finding reliable overseers, the scandals whispered about families in neighboring counties. Thomas stood and waited, a living piece of the room's decoration, while the wine was consumed and new bottles were requested. Each time he descended into the cool darkness of the cellar, selected the appropriate vintage, and returned to pour. By the fourth bottle, Ms. Ashford had developed a slight headache and excused herself. By the fifth, Miss Kendrick's hands had begun to tremble in a way she attempted to hide behind her fan. Mistress Eleanor herself looked paler than usual, though she attributed it to the oppressive heat and called for the windows to be opened wider. Only Thomas, who drank nothing but water from the well, remained unchanged. As the afternoon stretched into evening and the guests finally departed, he helped clear the glasses and bottles, carrying them back down to the cellar to be cleaned. Mistress Eleanor had retired to her bedroom with a cold compress on her forehead, complaining of the intensity of the sun. In the cellar's dimness, alone with the rows of bottles and the cool stone walls, Thomas allowed himself one moment of satisfaction. He picked up the unmarked bottle he had set aside earlier and held it to the light again. Inside, dissolved into the wine over weeks of patient waiting, was the sweet powder he had carefully scraped from the plantation's lead water pipes and mixed with sugar of lead, the women called it when they used it for their complexions, not knowing its true nature. He had learned about it from listening, always listening. From the overseer's complaints about the old pipes. From the cook's worries about the water sometimes tasting strange. From Mistress Eleanor herself, who kept a small jar of the white powder in her dressing room to whiten her skin. Light as seductive. Sweet as sugar. Poison as patient as he had learned to be. He returned the unmarked bottle to its place in the rack and began washing the used glasses in the basin of water. His reflection wavered in the dark liquid, a boy's face, thin and solemn, with eyes that had seen too much and remembered everything. But that was not where his story had begun. Part 2, Into the World On. Thomas had been born in the slave quarters of Rosewood Plantation on a February night in 1833, delivered by his grandmother's hands while sleet rattled against the cabin's single window. His mother, Celia, was 19 years old and had labored in the tobacco field since she was 7. His father was a man named Marcus who belonged to the neighboring Ashford plantation and who Celia had married by jumping the broom one summer evening, though the marriage had no legal standing and could be dissolved at any moment by either master's whim. The cabin where Thomas first drew breath was one of 12 that stood in 2 neat rows behind the main house, each structure measuring roughly 12 feet by 12 feet, housing anywhere from 4 to 8 people depending on family size. The walls were made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. The floor was packed earth. The single room contained a fireplace for cooking and warmth, a few wooden crates that served as furniture, and sleeping pallets made of corn husks and old blankets. Celia had named him Thomas after a brother sold away when she was a child, a name she spoke with a particular gentleness, as if by giving it to her son she might somehow call that lost boy back into existence. For the first 5 years of his life, Thomas belonged to the world of the quarters, a world of early darkness and shared meals, of women singing while they mended by firelight, of children playing in the narrow spaces between the cabins. His grandmother, old Ruth, watched over him and the other small children while their parents worked from dawn until well past dusk. She taught him his numbers by counting dry beans. She taught him the names of plants and which ones could heal. She taught him to be quiet when white folks were near and to never let them see what he was thinking. "You got your mama's mind," she told him once, tapping his forehead with one gnarled finger. "That's a dangerous thing for a slave child. A mind that sees too much. You learn to hide it, boy. Hide it deep." When Thomas was 6 years old, Master Charles Whitmore decided he was old enough to begin useful work. He was assigned to the house as a dining room servant, trained to stand behind chairs during meals, to fetch and carry, to be present and invisible simultaneously. It was in the dining room that Thomas first encountered the vast gulf between his world and theirs. The Whitmore family ate meals that could have fed everyone in the quarters for a week. Platters of roasted meats, bowls of vegetables swimming in butter, pies and cakes and preserves. Master Charles sat at the head of the table, a large man with graying hair and a face that turned red when he drank. Mistress Eleanor presided over the opposite end, younger than her husband by 15 years, always perfectly dressed, always watching everything with those sharp gray eyes. They had no children, a fact that seemed to pain Mistress Eleanor in ways she rarely acknowledged aloud. Thomas learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken. He learned which wines Master Charles preferred with which foods. He learned to move silently, to refill glasses without being asked, to appear the moment he was wanted and disappear just as quickly. He also learned to listen. The dining room was where the Whitmores discussed business, where they entertained neighbors and visiting relatives, where they spoke freely about matters they assumed their servants could not understand or would not remember. Thomas heard them discuss the prices of cotton and tobacco, the difficulty of managing enslaved workers, the politics of South Carolina and the growing tensions with the northern states. He heard them discuss people he knew as if they were livestock. "The girl Sarah is breeding again," Master Charles mentioned one evening over his roast beef. "Fourth time. Good strong children. She'll make back her cost in a few more years." Sarah was Thomas's aunt, his mother's younger sister. Her children were his cousins. Master Charles spoke of her as he might speak of a mare producing foals. Mistress Eleanor responded without looking up from her plate. "The boy Jacob shows promise. He might be trained for housework when he's older." Jacob was 8 years old, Thomas's friend, a child who could make anyone laugh with his imitations of the rooster that strutted around the yard. Thomas stood against the wall and kept his face empty, but inside himself he was learning to hate. Not the hot, immediate hatred that might lead to violence and swift punishment. That was a hatred that would get him killed. Instead, he cultivated something colder, a hatred like the winter frost that could split stone, patient and inevitable. When Thomas was 8, his father Marcus was sold. There had been some dispute between Master Charles and Mary Ashford over a property boundary, and though the dispute was eventually settled, the friendship between the two men never quite recovered. Mary Ashford sold Marcus to a trader heading to the deeper south, to the cotton plantations of Mississippi where men were worked to death in a handful of years. Thomas's mother wept for 3 days, a terrible silent weeping that shook her whole body. There was no funeral, no farewell. Marcus was simply gone, as if he had never existed. Thomas watched his mother's grief and understood that this was the way of their world. People could be erased at any moment, for any reason, or for no reason at all. Love was a dangerous thing. Attachment was a vulnerability. He began to construct walls inside himself, sorting his feelings into boxes that could be locked away. Fear went into one box. Grief into another. Anger into a third, sealed so tightly it would never escape without his permission. On the outside, he remained the quiet, obedient child who served at the master's table. On the inside, he was becoming someone else entirely. Part 3: The Education of Observation. When Thomas was 10 years old, Master Charles Whitmore died of an apoplexy while inspecting the tobacco fields on a particularly hot July afternoon. He collapsed among the plants, his face purple, gasping for air that would not come. By the time they carried him back to the house, he was already gone. The funeral was a grand affair. Relatives arrived from across the state. The enslaved workers were required to stand in neat rows during the burial, their heads bowed, their expressions appropriately somber. Thomas stood with the house servants and watched Mistress Eleanor, veiled in black, as she accepted condolences with a composure that seemed almost rehearsing. She was 32 years old and now a widow with no children, in possession of a plantation worth considerable money but with no clear male authority to manage it. Master Charles's brothers, William and Robert Whitmore, arrived within a week of the funeral, ostensibly to help their bereaved sister-in-law but in reality to assess what they might claim for themselves. Thomas served them dinner and listened to them talk around and over Mistress Eleanor, making plans for the disposition of the property as if she were not sitting right there at the table with them. "The house Negroes should be sold," William declared, gesturing with his wine glass. "You've too many for a woman living alone. You could take them off your hands at a fair price." "The land should be leased," Robert added. "You cannot possibly manage the cultivation yourself." Mistress Eleanor sat down her fork with precise care. "Hintleman, I appreciate your concern. However, I have no intention of selling any of my workers or leasing my land. This plantation is mine by law, and I intend to manage it." The brothers exchanged glances that spoke volumes of skepticism. Over the following weeks, Thomas watched as Mistress Eleanor proved herself more capable than anyone had expected. She met with the overseer daily, inspected the fields herself despite the summer heat, reviewed the accounts with a sharp eye that caught several instances of minor theft. She negotiated the sale of that year's tobacco crop for a better price than her husband had achieved in years. But there was one area where she felt uncertain, the wine cellar. Master Charles had been a collector, proud of his vintages, and had spent considerable sums acquiring bottles from France, Spain, Portugal, and Madeira. The cellar contained hundreds of bottles, representing thousands of dollars in value. Mistress Eleanor knew wine only as something served at dinner. She could not distinguish a good vintage from a poor one, could not identify when a bottle had turned, could not manage the collection that represented a significant portion of her wealth. She needed help, But she could not afford to show weakness by hiring an outside expert. The Whitmore brothers would seize on any sign of incompetence as proof she could not manage alone. It was the overseer, a man named Gideon Marsh, who suggested Thomas. The boy has a sharp memory, Marsh told her one afternoon when Thomas was within earshot, carrying fresh linens through the house. Watches everything. Never forgets a face or a name. Might be he could learn wine as well as he's learned table service. Mistress Eleanor studied Thomas with new interest. Can you read, boy? Thomas hesitated. Reading was forbidden for enslaved people in South Carolina, punishable by whipping. But he had taught himself anyway, piecing together letters from old newspapers the cook used for wrapping, from the spines of books in Master Charles's library, from scraps and fragments collected over years. He made a decision in that moment, a calculated risk. So me, mistress. A note to make out words. Here as narrowed, but not with anger. With calculation. I see. And you've been in the cellar before? Many times, mistress. Fetching bottles for the master. Very well. Beginning tomorrow, you will spend your mornings with me in the cellar. He will teach you what I know, and together we will learn what I do not. You will keep the inventory, maintain the temperature, and ensure the collection remains in good condition. Can you do this? Yes, mistress. If you do well, Thomas, you will eat better than the other house servants. You will have warmer clothes in winter. But if you fail, if you break bottles or let them spoil, you will be sent to the fields. Do you understand? Yes, mistress. It was both an opportunity and a trap, and Thomas recognized it as such. Mistress Eleanor was binding him to her through a combination of reward and threat, making him complicit in her success. If she prospered, he would prosper, within the narrow limits allowed to an enslaved person. If she failed, he would fall with her. He descended into the wine cellar the next morning with Mistress Eleanor and began his true education. She taught him first the basics, how wine should be stored on its side to keep the cork moist, how temperature and darkness were essential to proper aging, how to identify the different types of bottles and their contents. She showed him the inventory books Master Charles had kept, columns of numbers and dates and prices. You will learn to maintain these records, she told him. Every bottle that comes in, every bottle that goes out. You will note the date, the vintage, the occasion. Do you understand? Yes, mistress. And Thomas? No one else needs to know that you can read and write. Not the overseer, not the other servants, certainly not my brothers-in-law. This is between us. A secret is a valuable thing. Guard it carefully. In Nadith, understanding the game they were playing. She was trusting him with knowledge that could be dangerous for both of them, for him because literacy was forbidden, for her because she was teaching him, but more importantly because she was showing him the full extent of her assets, making him aware of things enslaved people were never supposed to know. In exchange, he was to help her maintain the illusion of competence and control. But Thomas was also receiving something else, access to information. The wine cellar became his classroom. The inventory books showed him not just wines but the financial health of the plantation. The bottles themselves represented connections to merchants in Charleston, to traders in Europe, to a wider world beyond the boundaries of Rosewood. He learned which wines were most valuable, which could be sold in times of need, which should be kept. He learned to taste, developing a palate that could distinguish between vintages and identify flaws. He learned the chemistry of fermentation, the art of decanting, the proper serving temperatures. Most importantly, he learned that knowledge itself was power, even for those who were supposed to be powerless. Mistress Eleanor began to rely on him. When guests came for dinner, she would consult him privately about which wines to serve. When bottles needed to be purchased, she would ask his opinion. When her brothers-in-law visited and made disparaging comments about her ability to manage the estate, she would lead them to the cellar and show them the meticulous records, the perfectly organized collection, and let them believe she had done it all herself. Thomas became her secret weapon, her invisible asset. And as the months passed and he grew more knowledgeable, he also grew more aware of the profound injustice of his situation. He was managing a wine collection worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime, yet he owned nothing, not even the clothes on his back. He could identify a wine's vintage by taste alone, yet he could not walk freely down a public road. He kept perfect records of thousands of dollars in assets, yet he himself was listed in those same account books with a cash value next to his name, as if he were no different than a bottle of Madeira. The contradiction ate at him quietly, day by day, like water wearing away stone. Part 4. The Chemistry of Patience. Thomas was 12 years old when he first learned about sugar of lead. It was a December afternoon, cold enough that frost had formed on the windows, and Mistress Eleanor had developed a headache that left her pale and irritable. She sent him to her dressing room to fetch a small jar from her collection of cosmetics, a jar of white powder she used occasionally to whiten her complexion. Mix a small amount with water, she instructed. It helps with the pain sometimes. Thomas carried the jar carefully, noting the label in his mistress's delicate handwriting, lead acetate, for complexion. He had seen her use it before, dabbing the diluted mixture on her face and neck, seeking the porcelain pallor that was fashionable among wealthy women. Later, when he was alone in the cellar, he thought about that jar. Lead acetate. He had heard the overseer, Gideon Marsh, complain about the old lead pipes that brought water from the spring to the house. They're corroding, Marsh had said. Leaving deposits. Makes the water taste sweet sometimes. Sweet water from lead pipes. Wheat powder for complexions. Thomas's mind made connections, drawing invisible lines between these scattered pieces of information. He began to read everything he could find about lead. Master Charles's library contained several books on chemistry and metallurgy, dusty volumes that no one had opened in years. Thomas would slip in during the early morning hours when the household was still asleep, before his duties in the cellar began, and read by the dim light of dawn. He learned that lead was a poison, slow-acting and cumulative. He learned that the ancient Romans had used lead pipes for their water and lead acetate to sweeten their wine, and that some scholars believed this had contributed to the empire's decline. He learned that the symptoms of lead poisoning, headaches, stomach pains, weakness, confusion, could mimic many other ailments and might not be recognized for what they were. He learned that sugar of lead was exactly what its name suggested, lead acetate, sweet to the taste, easily dissolved in liquid. This knowledge sat inside him like a seed waiting for the right season to germinate. Meanwhile, life at Rosewood Plantation continued its familiar rhythms. The seasons turned. Crops were planted and harvested. The enslaved workers rose before dawn and labored until after dusk. Children were born in the quarters, old people died. Thomas's mother Celia developed a persistent cough that the plantation's makeshift medicine could not cure. His grandmother, old Ruth, grew thin and frail. Thomas himself grew taller, his voice beginning to deepen, his shoulders broadening. He remained small for his age, slight and quick, but there was a wiry strength in him now. The work in the cellar, lifting bottles, carrying cases, rearranging the heavy racks, had made him stronger than he looked. Mistress Eleanor came to depend on him completely. The wine cellar was his domain now, and she rarely went down without him. When important guests visited, she would mention casually that she had a boy with quite the talent for wine, presenting this as evidence of her discerning eye rather than acknowledging how much she relied on his knowledge. The Whitmore brothers visited less frequently as it became clear that their sister-in-law was managing quite well without them. The plantation turned a small profit each year. The enslaved workers, while certainly not happy, were kept adequately fed and housed by the standards of the time, if only because Mistress Eleanor understood that dead or disabled workers represented lost investment. To the outside world, Rosewood appeared to be a well-run establishment under the capable management of a widow who had defied expectations. But inside the quarters, despair grew like mold in darkness. Jacob, Thomas's childhood friend who had shown such promise, was sold when he turned 13 to settle a minor debt. No warning, no farewell. Used gone one morning, the same way Thomas's father had disappeared years before. A young woman named Hannah, who had married the summer before, tried to run away with her husband. They were caught within 2 days. The husband was whipped 30 lashes and sold. Hannah was whipped 20 and kept, her spirit visibly broken, her eyes vacant. Thomas's mother Celia's cough grew worse. She still worked in the fields, because she had to, coughing until she spat blood into the dirt between the tobacco plants. Old Ruth died on a February morning, quietly in her sleep, and Thomas helped dig her grave in the small plot behind the quarters where enslaved people were buried without headstones or markers. Used bodies returned to earth, their names remembered only by those who had loved them. Each loss hardened something inside Thomas. The walls he had built within himself grew thicker, higher. He perfected the art of showing nothing on his face, revealing nothing in his voice. To Mistress Eleanor and the other white people on the plantation, he remained the obedient, competent boy who managed the wine cellar so efficiently. But when he was alone in that cellar, standing among the thousands of bottles that represented wealth built on the bodies of people like his grandmother, his mother, his father, enslaved, he imagined justice. Not the justice of the law, which recognized him as property rather than a person. Not the justice of God, which seemed distant and abstract and unhelpful. But a justice of his own making, patient and precise. The seed of knowledge about sugar of lead had germinated. Now it began to grow. Part 2. The Architecture of Revenge. Thomas was 13 when he began his careful work. It started with the water pipes, the corroded lead pipes that Overseer Marsh had complained about for years but which Mistress Eleanor had never found the funds to replace. Thomas studied them whenever he was alone, noting where the corrosion was worst, where white deposits had formed. Using a small knife from the kitchen, he would carefully scrape these deposits into a cloth during the early morning hours, working slowly over weeks and months to collect the powder without leaving obvious marks. He hid the cloth in the cellar, wrapped in old cloth and tucked behind a loose stone in the wall. From Mistress Eleanor's dressing room, when he was sent to fetch items, he would take tiny amounts of the lead acetate powder, spooning out quantities so small they would never be missed from the jar, replacing the volume with flour so the level appeared unchanged. He learned to mix the powder with sugar, creating a compound that was even sweeter than sugar of lead alone, easier to dissolve, less likely to be detected by taste. All of this he did slowly, patiently, without any immediate plan. He was simply gathering materials, preparing tools, like a carpenter assembling what he might need for a future project. He thought about the uses for such a substance. It could be mixed into food, but the kitchen was too busy, too crowded with other enslaved workers who might see. It could be mixed into water, but the household drew from the same well as the quarters, and he would not poison his own people. But wine was kept in the cellar, his domain, where he was often alone. Wine was consumed exclusively by white people. Wine was already somewhat mysterious in its flavors and variations, so that a slight sweetness might be attributed to the vintage rather than to anything added. Still, he did nothing. He continued his duties, managed the cellar, served at table, and waited. Then, in the winter of his 13th year, his mother died. Celia had been coughing blood for months, growing steadily weaker, but she had continued to work because she had no choice. One morning in January, she did not wake up. Thomas found her on her pallet in the cabin they shared with 3 other families, her body cold, her face peaceful. There was no doctor for enslaved people, no investigation into her death. She was buried next to old Ruth in the unmarked plot, and the plantation's account books noted a loss of asset value. At the funeral, such as it was, the people from the quarters gathered and sang spirituals about a better home awaiting in heaven. Thomas stood silent, dry-eyed, while they covered his mother's body with earth. Something inside him finished hardening that day. What vivid restraints had held him, whatever hope he had maintained for some other path, some other possibility, it died with her and was buried in that grave. They had no family left now. His father was gone, probably dead in Mississippi. His grandmother was gone. His mother was gone. He had friends in the quarters, people who cared about him, but the walls inside him were too thick now to let them in properly. He was alone, and that loneliness made him free in a terrible way. He had nothing left to lose. 2 weeks after his mother's burial, Thomas began adding sugar of lead to the wine. He started carefully, with bottles that would not be consumed for months. He would uncork them using a careful technique he had developed, insert a thin glass tube, and slowly introduce small amounts of the sweet poison, then reseal the bottle so perfectly that no one would suspect it had been tampered with. He kept meticulous notes in a code of his own devising, marking the bottles with tiny scratches on the glass that meant nothing to anyone else but allowed him to track which vintages had been treated. The amounts were small, enough to cause gradual harm over time, but not so much as to cause immediate, obvious poisoning. He had read enough about lead to know that it accumulated in the body, that its effects were chronic rather than acute. Headaches, stomach pains, weakness, confusion, memory problems. Eventually, with enough exposure over enough time, organ failure. Death. He worked slowly, over months, treating perhaps 1 bottle in every 10. He calculated that it would take a year, perhaps 2, before the effects became noticeable. By then, it would be nearly impossible to trace the cause. This was not a hot revenge, an explosion of violence that would result in his immediate death. This was cold, patient, methodical. It was inflicting on them the same slow destruction they had inflicted on him and his people, a grinding down, a gradual theft of health and life. If someone had asked him to articulate his reasoning, he might have struggled. It was not purely rational. It was not entirely about Mr. Cellar, who had been no crueler than any other owner, who had even shown him a kind of favor in teaching him about wine. It was about the system itself, the machinery of slavery that ground people into dust and called it economics. It was about his grandmother buried in an unmarked grave. His father sold and lost. His mother coughed to death in a cabin while the big house slept in comfort. It was about Jacob and Hannah and all the others whose names would never be recorded, whose lives would never be acknowledged. It could not destroy that system. One enslaved boy could not bring down the institution of slavery. But he could introduce poison into it, literally and symbolically. It could corrupt the very substance that represented leisure and luxury, the one that wealthy white people served at their tables while congratulating themselves on their refinement and civilization. It continued his work through the spring and into the summer of 1847, moving with absolute care, never hurrying, never taking risks. He became even more attentive to Mistress Eleanor, even more useful, ensuring that she had no reason to suspect him of anything but the most perfect loyalty. She, in turn, continued to rely on him completely. When guests came for dinner, it was Thomas who selected the wines, Thomas who decanted them, Thomas who served. It was so much a part of the household machinery that he had become invisible in his importance. By August, roughly half the bottles in the cellar had been treated to some degree. Thomas had developed a system where he would mark each treated bottle's level of poisoning, 1 scratch for a small amount, 2 for moderate, 3 for heavy. He had become an artist of slow death. And then Mistress Eleanor announced that she would be hosting an afternoon gathering of the most prominent ladies in the county, a social event designed to demonstrate her standing as a woman of sophistication and taste. She called Thomas to her sitting room one morning to discuss the wines. "This is an important occasion," she told him. "Mrs. Ashford will be there, and Mrs. Pemberton. Caroline Whitmore is coming from Charleston. You need to make an impression. What do you recommend?" Thomas thought carefully, studying her face. She looked tired, he noticed. There were shadows under her eyes that had not been there a year ago. She had been suffering from headaches more frequently, he knew, and occasional stomach complaints. "The Madeira would be appropriate, Mistress," he said. "The 38 vintage. It has matured beautifully. The 38 vintage. One of the most heavily treated bottles in the cellar. 3 scratches. Excellent," she said, smiling at him with something almost like warmth. "You have such good instincts, Thomas. You don't know what I would do without you." The compliment should have troubled him, should have introduced some element of doubt or hesitation. But he was beyond such considerations now. She was kind to him in the way someone might be kind to a useful tool, and he accepted her kindness the way a knife accepts a whetstone, as something that made him sharper. Part B. The Gathering Storm. The morning of the gathering, Thomas rose before dawn and went to the cellar. He stood in the cool darkness among the bottles, feeling the weight of what he had done and what was about to happen. He could still stop it. He could select different bottles, could claim the Madeira had spoiled, could find any number of excuses. But the thought of stopping never truly occurred to him. He had set this mechanism in motion, and now it would run its course. The day was brutally hot, even by August standards. The kind of heat that made the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. In the kitchen, the cook and her helpers prepared tea cakes and small sandwiches. In the main house, Mistress Eleanor dressed carefully in a gown of lavender silk, arranging her hair, applying her cosmetics, including, Thomas noted, the lead acetate powder that she believed improved her complexion. They were poisoning themselves from multiple directions, these wealthy white people, and they had no idea. The guests began arriving around 2 in the afternoon. Mrs. Ashford came first, her carriage rattling up the Oakland Drive, followed shortly by Mrs. Pemberton and Caroline Whitmore. Miss Sarah Kendrick, the young woman from Charleston, arrived last, stepping out of her carriage with the particular grace of someone conscious of being watched. Thomas served them in the dining room, which had been prepared with Mistress Eleanor's finest tablecloth and her mother's china. He poured tea and offered cakes, moving silently among them while they talked. The conversation was typical of such gatherings, gossip about neighbors, discussion of fashions, complaints about the difficulty of managing household servants. Thomas listened and said nothing, his face carefully neutral. The heat is dreadful, Mrs. Ashford declared, fanning herself. I told Mrs. Ashford we should spend August at the shore, but he refuses to leave the plantation during harvest season. Men never understand these things, Caroline Whitmore agreed. They're content to swelter while we suffer. Mistress Eleanor smiled. Perhaps some wine would help us bear the temperature. Thomas, bring up the Madeira. He bowed slightly and descended to the cellar, his heart beating with perfect calm. He found the bottle he had selected, the 38 vintage with 3 scratches on its base, and carried it carefully up the stairs. The ritual of opening and pouring took on a ceremonial quality. The ladies watched him with the mild interest they might give to any well-trained servant performing his duties. He filled each glass with precise amounts of the amber liquid. To friendship, Mistress Eleanor said, raising her glass. To friendship, the others echoed, and drank. Thomas stepped back against the wall and waited. The wine's effect was not immediate, of course. Lead poisoning was a slow process. But he knew that this particular bottle contained enough poison that its regular consumption would accelerate whatever damage had already been done by the other bottles these women had drunk over the past months. Mrs. Ashford, for instance, had dined at Rosewood at least once a month. She had probably consumed a dozen treated bottles over the past year. Mrs. Pemberton slightly less, perhaps 8 or 9. Mistress Eleanor herself had drunk treated wine nearly daily. The sweetness is quite pronounced, Mrs. Pemberton observed, exactly as she would later that afternoon, in the scene where this story began. Almost honey. The 38 was an exceptional year, Mistress Eleanor replied, repeating what Thomas had told her. They continued drinking, requesting more bottles as the afternoon wore on. Thomas brought up a second bottle of the Madeira, then a third. Each one had been carefully treated, each one marked with his secret scratches. By the 4th bottle, Mrs. Ashford complained of a headache and excused herself early, her carriage taking her home before sunset. By the 5th, Miss Kendrick's hands had developed a fine tremor that she attempted to hide. Mistress Eleanor herself had grown pale, complaining of the heat and retiring to her bedroom with a cold compress. Thomas cleaned up after the gathering with methodical care, washing the glasses, returning the bottles to the cellar. When he was alone in the cellar's darkness, he allowed himself a moment to feel what he had done. It was not satisfaction exactly. The emotion was more complex, a sense of having balanced some cosmic scale, however slightly. They say women who had drunk his poisoned wine would suffer, perhaps that, but their suffering would be gradual and comparatively painless compared to the suffering he had witnessed in the quarters. They would die in their beds, tended by doctors, mourned by families. His grandmother had died in a cabin, with nothing but old blankets and the prayers of other enslaved people. His mother had coughed herself to death while still working in the fields. His father had disappeared into the hell of the deep south cotton plantations. The justice was imperfect, but it was all he could create. Part 7, the ripples. Over the following weeks, the effects of the poisoning began to manifest more clearly. Mrs. Ashford fell into a decline that her doctor attributed to hysteria and woman's weakness. She suffered from persistent headaches, memory problems, and a strange metallic taste in her mouth. By September, she was confined to her bed more often than not. Miss Kendrick returned to Charleston earlier than planned, complaining of feeling unwell. Letters arrived at Rosewood reporting that she had developed a tremor in her hands that prevented her from doing needlework and that her constitution had been damaged by the country air. Mrs. Pemberton seemed to recover initially but then suffered a series of stomach ailments that left her thin and weak. Mistress Eleanor's condition deteriorated most noticeably. The headaches she had experienced occasionally became chronic. She developed stomach pains that made eating difficult. Her hands shook when she tried to write. Her complexion, which she had worked so hard to keep pale with her lead powder, took on a grayish cast. The overseer, Gideon Marsh, suggested she call for a doctor from Charleston, someone more skilled than the local physician. Dr. Samuel Hartwell arrived on an October morning, a lean man in his 50s with sharp eyes and careful hands. He examined Mistress Eleanor thoroughly, asked questions about her symptoms, her diet, her daily routines. Thomas served them tea while they talked, standing silently against the wall. "How long have you experienced these headaches?" Dr. Hartwell asked. "Since the spring, I think. They've grown progressively worse." "And the stomach pains?" "More recently. The past month or so." "Do you use cosmetics?" The question seemed to surprise her. "Yes, Of course. What woman doesn't? What type of cosmetics? Specifically? She listed them: powders, creams, rouges. When she mentioned the lead acetate powder for her complexion, Dr. Hartwell's expression shifted slightly. I see. And do you drink wine regularly? Yes. Most evenings with dinner, and when entertaining guests. What variety of wine? Various types. The boy there, she gestured at Thomas, manages our cellar and selects appropriate vintages. Dr. Hartwell turned to look at Thomas directly, studying him with an intensity that made Thomas's pulse quicken, though he showed nothing on his face. How old are you, boy? 14, sir. And you manage the wine cellar? Yes, sir. Mistress Eleanor taught me. I see. Dr. Hartwell turned back to Mistress Eleanor. I would like to examine your wine cellar, if I might, and I'd like to test a sample of the water from your well. Thomas' heart was beating faster now, but his face remained perfectly calm. He led the doctor down to the cellar, carrying a lamp to light the way. Dr. Hartwell examined the bottles, selected several at random, and asked Thomas to open them. He smelled each one carefully, tasted small amounts, and made notes in a leather-bound journal. How often do you clean and maintain these bottles? He asked Thomas. Weekly, sir. He checked them for signs of spoilage, keep the temperature constant, ensure the corks remain moist. Do you taste the wines as part of this process? Sometimes, sir. Mistress Eleanor taught me to identify when a wine has turned. But you yourself do not drink the wine? No, sir. Only to taste for quality. Dr. Hartwell made another note. And you've noticed nothing unusual? No changes in the flavor or consistency of the wines? This was the critical moment. Thomas could confess now, could explain what he had done. The impulse to confess was surprisingly strong, a desire to be known, to have his actions recognized even if it meant his death. But he had not come this far to fail now. Some bottles taste sweeter than others, sir, he said carefully. Depending on the vintage and the grape. But I'm just a boy. He wouldn't presume to judge unusual. Dr. Hartwell studied him for a long moment, and Thomas had the unsettling feeling that the man saw through him completely, understood exactly what had happened. But after a moment, the doctor simply nodded and closed his journal. Thank you. You may return to your duties. Thomas climbed the stairs back to the main house, his legs slightly unsteady, and resumed his position outside the sitting room where Dr. Hartwell and Mistress Eleanor were conferring. He could not hear everything they said, but he caught fragments. Chronic exposure to lead. The cosmetics certainly, but the severity suggests another source. The water pipes should be replaced immediately. I recommend you cease drinking wine for several months. Mistress Eleanor's voice, weak and confused, but how could the wine? The old Romans sweetened their wine with lead, Dr. Hartwell explained. It's possible that your bottles have been stored near lead pipes or that lead has leached into the wine from some other source. It's also possible that someone has deliberately introduced lead into the wine, though that seems unlikely given your circumstances. A long silence. Then Mistress Eleanor's voice, frightened now, you think someone might have poisoned me? I think it's one possibility among several. But without more evidence, I cannot say for certain. What I can say is that you must avoid all possible sources of lead exposure immediately. Replace the water pipes. Cease using lead-based cosmetics. Do not drink wine from your cellar until the bottles can be properly tested. And the others? The ladies who drank wine at my gathering? If they consumed wine from the same bottles, they may be suffering similar exposure. He will write to their physicians with my findings. More discussion followed, but Thomas had heard enough. He returned to the cellar and sat in the darkness among the bottles, thinking. Dr. Hartwell suspected poisoning but could not prove it. He had suggested multiple possible sources of lead exposure, making it nearly impossible to isolate the wine as the primary cause. Even if he did determine that the wine had been deliberately poisoned, how could he prove who had done it? Thomas was the obvious suspect, of course, he had access, opportunity, knowledge. But he was also an enslaved child, carefully trained, closely supervised. The idea that he could have orchestrated such a complex, long-term poisoning seemed implausible to minds that believed enslaved people were inherently simple, incapable of such planning. They might suspect him, but they would have no proof. Still, he knew that his time at Rosewood was probably ending. Whether or not they could prove what he had done, the suspicion alone would be enough. Mistress Eleanor would want him gone, removed from the household as a precaution. It would be sold, most likely. Sent to work in the fields or shipped to another plantation, another master. The thought should have terrified him, but he felt only a strange calm. He had done what he meant to do. He had introduced poison into the system, literally and metaphorically. Several wealthy white women were now suffering the effects of lead exposure, their health damaged, their futures uncertain. It was not everything he might have wished, but it was something. It was a mark left on history, even if no one would ever know his name or understand what he had done. Part 8. The Unraveling. In the days following Dr. Hartwell's visit, Rosewood Plantation began to change. Workers arrived to replace the lead pipes, tearing into walls and digging trenches across the property. The well was tested and declared safe, but the pipes that carried water from the well to the house were completely replaced with new iron ones. Mistress Eleanor stopped wearing her complexion powders and threw away all her lead-based cosmetics. She stopped drinking wine entirely, instead taking prescribed tonics that Dr. Hartwell had left for her. And she stopped speaking to Thomas except when absolutely necessary. He continued his duties in the wine cellar, but she no longer consulted him about selections. She no longer taught him about new vintages. The easy familiarity they had developed over 3 years was gone, replaced by a careful distance. Overseer Marsh began watching Thomas more closely, appearing in the cellar at unexpected times, asking questions about his activities. Thomas answered everything calmly and honestly, showing no signs of nervousness or guilt. After 2 weeks, Dr. Hartwell returned with results from tests he had conducted on the wine samples. Thomas was not present for the conversation, but he learned about it later from the cook, who had been cleaning in the hallway and overheard. High levels of lead acetate in multiple bottles, Dr. Hartwell had reported. Concentrated enough to suggest deliberate introduction rather than environmental contamination. Someone has been poisoning your wine, Mrs. Whitmore. The household erupted in suspicion and fear. The white servants, the cook, the maid, the housekeepers, were all questioned. Could any of them have accessed the cellar? Did they have any grudge against Mistress Eleanor? Had they noticed anything unusual? The enslaved workers were questioned even more harshly. Overseer Marsh lined them up in the yard and demanded to know if anyone had seen anything suspicious, anyone entering or leaving the cellar at unusual times. Everyone denied knowledge. Some were clearly terrified. Others seemed genuinely confused. Thomas stood in the line with the others, his face showing appropriate concern but no guilt. When Marsh questioned him directly, he answered simply. I am in the cellar most days, sir. You have the key and the responsibility. I have seen no one else there without Mistress Eleanor's permission. And you've noticed nothing unusual about the wine? As I told the doctor, sir, some bottles taste sweeter than others. But I thought that was normal for different vint.